Howdy, and welcome back to the Principle Over Party podcast YouTube series. I appreciate you joining me. In this video, we're going to be talking about the impact of the Fed. With that being said, let's get right into it. So every time you swipe your card to take out a loan or hear the word recession on the news, one name echoes in the background, the Federal Reserve. But what exactly does the Fed do, and how does it shape your daily lives? In this video, we're breaking down the real impact of the Fed, how interest rates, inflation, and monetary policy ripple through the economy, influence your wallet, and shift the tides of global markets. From rate hikes to quantitative easing, we're going to go deep in on how the central bank pulls the strings and why understanding their next move could be the smartest financial decision you ever make. Thank you for joining me. Cue the intro. If America has a hidden government, it isn't just the alphabet agencies or the clandestine backrooms of Washington. It's in a building most people never will walk into, run by people most voters can't even name. For over a century, the Federal Reserve has quietly controlled the lifeblood of America, our money. We are told it brings stability. We are told it prevents crises. We are told it exists to serve us. But the record shows something very different. From depressions to recessions to bubbles to bailouts, the Fed has shaped and often shaken the destiny of every American. This essay is not a technical breakdown of interest rates or balance sheets, although I did take, a few accounting and finance classes at A&M. There's no way I could possibly convey any useful information to y'all, so don't be discouraged. But this video is a history, and I plan to tell it like a story. The story of how the Fed was born, what it has done, and how it continues to rewrite the rules of freedom and prosperity here in our nation. All right, we're going to start with the birth of the Federal Reserve. I know it's boring, but I think it's important to give some background information. So America's banking system in the past was decentralized, fragmented, and often volatile. Hundreds of banks issued their own notes, and while that created flexibility, it also meant that panics, sudden waves of bank runs, could ripple throughout the economy. The most famous of these panics was the Panic of 1907. The Panic of 1907, a collapse caused by reckless speculation, became the excuse politicians and financiers needed to push for centralization. It began with speculation. Financier F. August Heinz tried to corner the market on the United States copper stock. His scheme failed, and when investors realized it, panic spread quickly. Banks associated with Heinz's group collapsed, depositors rushed to withdraw funds, and within days, confidence in the financial system evaporated totally. And then something extraordinary happened. The government didn't step in. Instead, one man did, J.P. Morgan, the titan of American finance. He gathered New York's top bankers in his private library for a meeting. He locked the doors, demanded that they pool resources, and orchestrated massive bailouts of failing banks and trust companies. For weeks, Morgan and his associates acted as the nation's de facto central bank, deciding who would be saved and who would fail. Within 3 years, the infamous secret meeting at Jekyll Island brought together Senator Nelson Aldrich, Paul Walberg, and the representatives of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller interests to draft what would soon become the Federal Reserve as we know it today. By 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and the United States handed over control of its money supply to an institution neither fully public or fully private. The promise was stability, but the reality was something else, a cartel of powerful interests with the ability to expand or contract the money supply at will. From day one, the Fed was not a simple, neutral referee. It was an active player. Now we're going to go into the boom, bust, and Great Depression part of this video. The 1920s were the Fed's first real test, and its first real failure. After World War I, America emerged as the world's dominant economic power. The gold standard had been weakened by war finance, but the US dollar was ascendant, and Wall Street was booming. This was the backdrop for the so-called Roaring '20s, the Jazz Age, the Flapper era, the glamorous world you read about in The Great Gatsby. I know y'all read it in middle school. But beneath the champagne and stock tickers was a dangerous illusion. From 1921 onward, the Federal Reserve pursued an aggressive policy of credit expansion. Interest rates were held artificially low, and banks flooded the market with easy loans. Businesses borrowed cheaply, consumers bought on credit, and stock prices soared. The official narrative was that this was prosperity, but Rothbard and other Austrian economists saw it differently. It was a bubble, built not on real savings and productivity, but on paper credit conjured up by the Fed. The Fed wasn't a passive observer. It deliberately fueled the boom, inflating the money supply by over 60% between 1921 and 1929. Sound familiar? Stocks skyrocketed, speculation ran rampant, and Americans began to believe that the new era could never end. President Hoover himself proclaimed that poverty was banished from the nation. Then, in 1929, the illusion shattered. The bubble burst, stock markets collapsed, and the credit structure built on cheap money came tumbling down. The Great Depression had begun. All of this led to the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, the mainstream story, the one taught in most history classes, I know mine, is that the Fed failed to act. The crash spiraled out of control because central bankers didn't inject enough money soon enough. This is the Keynesian narrative, the typical economics we learned in school. But from a Rothbardian perspective, the problem wasn't that the Fed did too little, it was that the Fed had done far too much. By artificially expanding credit for nearly a decade, the Fed had created an unstable boom in the first place. The crash wasn't a mystery, it was an inevitable correction of a distorted market. And then when the collapse came, the Fed made things worse. Instead of allowing the market to liquidate bad investments and reset naturally, the Fed and Hoover administration intervened, propping up failing businesses, freezing wages, raising tariffs, and desperately trying to hold the house of cards together. Now I'm going to go over the Fed and war, the correlation between our Federal Reserve and the continuous war machine of the United States since World War II. If money is the lifeblood of a nation, war is where that lifeblood is drained the fastest. And here is where the Federal Reserve reveals its true nature, not as a protector of stability, but as the enabler of endless conflict. Before the Fed, wars were naturally constrained. Governments had to raise taxes or borrow directly from the public, both of which faced natural resistance. A taxpayer who feels the burden of a war can vote against it. A lender will only fund a government if it believes it can pay them back. In other words, war had built-in limits, but with the creation of the Fed in 1913, those limits evaporated. For the first time, the US government had a mechanism to conjure vast sums of money out of nothing. Instead of persuading citizens to fund wars honestly, politicians could quietly finance them through inflation and debt, costs that the public wouldn't fully see until years later, when their dollars bought less and their savings had evaporated. World War I was the Fed's first great test. Barely a year after the Fed's creation, kind of coincidental, Europe was engulfed in war. When America entered in 1917, the US government needed resources on a scale it had never seen before, and the Fed delivered. It expanded credit, bought government bonds, and flooded the system with paper money. The cost of the war was hidden not through taxes, but through the slow bleed of inflation. World War II followed the same pattern on an even larger scale. The Fed kept interest rates artificially low to help Washington borrow massively. The national debt exploded from $50 billion to over $250 billion in just 5 years. Again, the cost wasn't felt at the ballot box, but at the grocery store. Inflation after the war quietly transferred wealth from savers to the state. And it didn't stop there. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each war was financed not by explicit consent of the governed, but by the silent theft of inflation. Without the Fed's power to create money, these wars would have been far more difficult to sustain. As Rothbard argued, central banking is the ultimate war machine, because once a government can print at will, it is no longer accountable to its citizens in the same way. Inflation becomes a hidden tax, draining the people without their permission. The tragic irony of this is that Americans are told the Fed exists to protect them for stability. In reality, it has financed the very wars that have destabilized nations abroad and impoverished generations at home. The founders warned us about standing armies and endless wars. Remember that little old General Smedley Butler and his silly little book, War is a Racket? So now I'm going to talk about the modern-ish era of the Fed, essentially diving into Nixon and the death of gold standard. So by the late 1960s, US dollar still had a tether to reality, gold. Under the post-World War II Bretton Woods system, the dollar was the world's reserve currency, and foreign governments could redeem their dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. On paper, that gave the dollar credibility. It was as good as gold. But in practice, America had been cheating. To fund the Vietnam War abroad and the Great Society programs at home, Washington spent far more than it could ever cover. The Federal Reserve printed money to bridge the gap, inflating the currency supply far beyond the gold backing that supposedly stood behind it. Foreign governments began to notice, and they wanted their gold back. France, famously under Charles de Gaulle, sent ships across the Atlantic to demand physical gold in exchange for the swelling pile of US dollars. By 1971, the game was completely up. The gold leaving Fort Knox and the Treasury vaults threatened to drain America's reserves completely. On August 15, 1971, he went on national television and announced that the US would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. In reality, this was the death of the gold standard, the final severing of money from the tangible value that it backed. Sidebar, the government has such a great track record of taking a mile and giving an inch. I mean, think about the temporary income tax post-World War I. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's just food for thought. Nixon sold the move as necessary to protect Americans from international speculators, but in truth, it was the United States itself that had speculated. It speculated that it could print money without consequence, finance wars without restraint, and run deficits forever. The gold standard was the last link in government spending to actual reality, and Nixon cut it. The consequences were immediate. The 1970s brought stagflation, a toxic combination of high inflation with stagnant growth that Keynesian economics had declared impossible before. Gas lines, skyrocketing prices, and collapsing purchasing power defined the decade. Ordinary Americans paid the price for Washington's great monetary experiment. And in the long-term consequences, they were even more profound. Once the money was entirely fiat, backed by nothing but government decree, the Federal Reserve power became virtually unlimited. It could inflate without restraint, enabling an explosion of debt, speculation, and government growth. Every war, bailout, and every welfare expansion since has been financed not by honest taxation, but by the printing press. From a Rothbardian perspective, the Nixon shock wasn't just a policy shift, it was a cultural and moral rupture. Now moving on to the section titled The Fed, Public Sounding Privately Owned, kind of diving into the weird contradiction of the Fed in itself. The Federal Reserve is often presented as a government institution, but in reality, it's a hybrid creature, part public facade, part private cartel. On the surface, it looks official. The Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. But this is where the illusion of democratic control ends. Beneath that layer sits the real structure: 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, each organized as a private corporation. So who owns them? The member commercial banks in their districts. By law, these banks are required to purchase stock in their regional Fed bank. That stock cannot be sold or traded, but it does pay a guaranteed 6% annual dividend, risk-free profit that comes directly from the central bank's operations. The largest Wall Street banks therefore literally own the backbone of the Federal Reserve System. The Fed is not funded through congressional appropriation processes like other government agencies. It generates its own income, largely from the interest it earns on the U.S. government securities it buys with the money it creates out of thin air. It then pays operating expenses, dividends to the banks, and sends the rest back to the Treasury. This means the Fed exists in a strange zone of independence. It's not accountable to the taxpayers in any real way, yet it wields total control over the value of the taxpayers' money. Critics like Rothbard have called the Fed exactly what it is: a cartel of private banks backed by the power of the state. The government benefits because it gets an endless line of credit to fund wars and welfare. The banks benefit because they profit directly from the Fed's policies and protection. And the American people lose through inflation, bailouts for the elite, and an economy distorted by central planning. So when we say the Fed is private, we don't mean it's a normal business you can buy stock in on the market. We mean its real ownership and incentives are aligned with the banking elite, not with the American citizen. Its power is shielded from democratic accountability, yet it touches every dollar you earn, spend, or save. Now moving on to the bubbles, bailouts, and the modern Fed. If the 1920s showed the Fed's destructive power to inflate bubbles, the modern era has shown us that nothing has changed except the stakes are bigger and the costs fall heavier on ordinary Americans. The late 1990s gave us the dot-com bubble, fueled by cheap credit and euphoric speculation in technology stocks. But when it burst in 2000, trillions of dollars of paper wealth vanished overnight. The Fed's solution? Cut interest rates even further, flooding the system with liquidity. But that easy money didn't rebuild the tech sector. It poured into housing, inflating the next and even bigger bubble. By the early 2000s, mortgages were being handed out to anyone with a pulse. I know you've seen the Big Short stripper scene with Steve Carell. Wall Street packed them into exotic securities and sold them all around the world. And the whole structure rested on one thing: artificially cheap money printed from the Fed. In 2008, it all collapsed. The housing bubble popped, Lehman Brothers failed, and the global financial system nearly froze. Millions of Americans lost their homes, their jobs, and retirement savings. But here's the bitter truth: the people who caused the crisis didn't pay the price. The Federal Reserve stepped in, not to protect homeowners or people like you and me, but to protect the banks. Trillions of dollars were created to bail out the very institution whose recklessness and gambling caused the disaster in the first place. This was the birth of quantitative easing, a sanitized term for money printing on a scale the world had never seen before. I know it sounds complicated, but kind of boil it down. The Feds bought toxic assets propped up by the stock market and pumped trillions into the financial system. Wall Street recovered almost instantly. Bonuses returned, stock prices soared, but Main Street never truly recovered. Wages stagnated, small business doors closed, and wealth inequality exploded in our nation. The rich who owned financial assets grew richer. The working and middle classes who relied on wages and savings left behind. And then came 2020. Faced with a pandemic and government-imposed shutdown, the Fed hit the printing press harder than ever. Stimulus checks made headlines, but behind the scenes, trillions more were created to rescue corporations, prop up bond markets, and keep the system on life support. The result? The highest inflation in 40 years. Gas, groceries, housing, everything became unaffordable almost overnight. I remember being in elementary school during Obama's presidency and hearing about how, the $8 trillion that we printed was so insurmountable that we would never be able to pay it off. Now it's at $36 trillion. Let that sink in. Once again, the Fed's cure was worse than the disease. The Fed creates bubbles with easy credit, the bubbles burst, then the Fed bails out the biggest players while ordinary people like you and me suffer. And each bailout plants the seeds for the next, larger crisis. The mainstream story frames the Fed as a firefighter rushing into the house, dousing the flames when the economy burns. But in reality, the Fed is the arsonist. It sets the fires with its reckless credit expansion, then claims credit for putting them out, all while ensuring the culprits walk free. From a Rothbardian perspective, this is not an accident. It is the natural consequence of giving a central bank the power to manipulate money. Booms and busts are not market failures. They are Fed-made disasters. The institution designed to provide stability has given us nothing but instability. Each cycle worse than the last. Each bailout enriching the elites at the expense of the poor people. The modern Fed is not a guardian to the economy. It is a machine for transferring wealth from the bottom to the top, from the productive to the politically connected, from the future to the present. And as long as it holds the power to conjure money out of thin air, the cycle of bubbles and bailouts will never end. Now I'm going to move to the next part of this essay, the philosophy of fiat. When money is backed by nothing, it teaches people to believe in nothing. Fiat currency, money created by decree, serves wealth from work, reward from responsibility, and government power from accountability. Sound money tied to something scarce like gold disciplines both individuals and the state. It rewards thrift, planning, and honest exchange. Fiat money destroys those virtues. It punishes savers through inflation, rewards debt and speculation, and transfers wealth quietly from the working class to the political and financial elite. The principle at stake is simple. If government can print money at will, then there are no limits. Wars can be waged without consent. Debts can grow without end. A culture built on discipline and responsibility is replaced by one built on illusion and dependency. The philosophy of fiat is the philosophy of control. Control over the value of your labor, your savings, and your future. And the repercussions are everywhere. Rising inequality, endless war, collapsing trust, and people untethered from the very virtues that make liberty possible. This is why sound money is not just about economics, it's about freedom. If the state can print unlimited money, then there are no brakes on its power. Every war, every welfare program, every bailout becomes possible. Not because the people consented, but because the printing press made it so. Fiat money severs the government from accountability, and once accountability is gone, liberty soon will follow. The next section of this video is titled The Future. The trajectory of America under the Federal Reserve is one of power without accountability. Our national debt climbs by trillions, and the Fed makes it possible by conjuring money out of thin air. Each new dollar weakens the ones already in your pocket, quietly stealing from savers, retirees, workers, while giving the state, its favorite institutions, endless credit. But the future of the Fed isn't just about inflation or debt, it's about control. Central bank digital currencies already being tested around the world would give the Fed unprecedented authority. Unlike cash, a digital dollar could be tracked, traced, or even shut off at the push of a button. Imagine if money that expires if you don't spend it quick enough, or transactions denied because they don't align with the approved policies. Some people might claim, I have nothing to hide, so why should I care? The same logic that got the Patriot Act passed. Do I even need to point out the stupidity in that statement? It's akin to allowing every police officer to search your house or car at any time, because if you didn't have anything to hide, why would you not? That isn't speculation. It's the logical extension of fiat money married to digital surveillance. The principle at stake is simple. Whoever controls the money controls freedom. Inflation steals wealth quietly. Debt enslaves generations invisibly. And digital money threatens to strip liberty openly, in real time. If the Fed remains unchecked, the America of tomorrow will not be the land of the free, but the land of permission. Every purchase, every saving decision, every economic choice is filtered through the eyes of a central authority. A country where freedom is celebrated in speeches but not in practice. The future of the Fed is not just a question of economics. It's a question of whether Americans still have the courage to demand independence, not only in government, but in money itself. Now I'm going to talk about the part all you, anti-Fedders have been wanting to talk about, benefits of abolishing the Fed. What would it mean to live in America without the Federal Reserve? For some, the idea sounds radical, but in truth, it would mean returning the money and credit to the discipline of reality and to the people themselves. Without the Fed, there would be no printing press to quietly erode savings through inflation. Money would once again be tied to something scarce and real, rewarding thrift and punishing recklessness. Government would be forced to live within its means, financing wars and programs honestly through taxation, not through deception. Politicians would no longer have a blank check for endless spending. For ordinary Americans, abolishing the Fed would mean stability rooted in sound money. Prices would reflect real supply and demand, not the whims of central bankers. Bubbles and bailouts would fade as markets were allowed to correct naturally. Wealth would flow towards production, not speculation. But beyond economics, the benefit would be moral and cultural. A nation freed from fiat would be a nation forced to relearn responsibility, savings, and honesty. The hidden tax of inflation would end, and with it, one of the greatest tools of the state control. The benefit of abolishing the Fed is simple. Liberty. Liberty from endless inflation, liberty from debt slavery, liberty from the quiet theft of the central bank. For over a century, America has been told that only the Fed can protect us. The truth is the opposite. By abolishing it, Americans protect themselves. Wealth would flow towards production, not speculation. But beyond economics, the benefits would be moral and cultural. A nation freed from fiat would be a nation forced to relearn responsibility, savings, and honesty. The hidden tax of inflation would end, and with it, one of the greatest tools of state control. The benefit of abolishing the Fed is simple. Liberty. Liberty from endless inflation, liberty from debt slavery, liberty from quiet theft of a central bank. For over a century, America has been told that only the Fed can protect us. The truth is the opposite. Only by abolishing it can Americans protect themselves. So now I'm pretty much going to wrap up with a closing statement. For over a century, the Federal Reserve has reshaped America's economy, its politics, and its very culture. Not in the name of liberty, but in the name of control. Inflation, endless debt, and perpetual war are not accidents of history. They're the logical consequences of a system designed to serve the state and the banks at the expense of the people. But the future is not yet written. We can question it, we can challenge it, and we can demand something better. Sound money, honest banks, and real accountability. That's why I am trying to make these videos, to question everything, to expose the lies we've been sold, and to fight for principles that actually preserve freedom. If you believe these conversations matter, if you want more deep dives into the truths that others avoid, then join me here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still thinks the Fed exists to protect them. Maybe their mind will change. Together, we can build a community that doesn't just accept the official story, but demands the truth. Thank you again for joining me here at Principle Over Party. I appreciate it. Like and subscribe. God bless.